Yeah. No.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 130th Melbourne AWS user group for September 2023, which you all know because you arrived on the right day. Thank you all for coming. We should have a good night with two great speakers and fantastic topics. But first, you'll have to bear with me for a couple minutes. But I will start with an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Melbourne AWS user group acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. Our in-person meetup is being held on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners of this land. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today. In addition, I just want to point out we have a code of conduct here, which we all expect you to adhere to. There's a short version here, a longer version is on the website, and the very, very short version is be nice to each other. If you feel like somebody is not following the code of conduct, you can reach out to one of the organizers, or we have an online form as well if you would prefer to be anonymous. So please do so if that happens, which we hope it doesn't. We are on the web. Our website is melbourne.awsug.org.au. On LinkedIn, on Mastodon, YouTube, all similar names. There used to be another logo here, but somebody X'd that out, so it's no longer something we deal with. Tonight's program, introductions, that's the boring bit I'm doing now. After that, I've got Jason and Matt who will be presenting what's new in AWS. This is our section where they go over some of the highlights from the last month of announcements, because as you all know, AWS tends to release a lot of stuff. Then we've got our first speaker, Colin, who will be talking about IAM and set theory. This is going to be very mathy, I'm guessing. Yep. And this is followed by Rinaldi, who was sitting over there. Cool. About building an anonymous chat forum on AWS. So both should be very interesting. And we'll close off with a marketplace segment. That's basically who's hiring, where we'll ask anybody who's hiring to hold up their hands. So to do 30-second spiel of who they are, who they work for, what they're looking for, and people can then approach them. We do it this way around to avoid the unfortunate circumstance of you're looking for a job and your manager is sitting right next to you who's not aware yet. Then you don't want to hold up your hand. So this way you can actually approach people. And then we're done for the night. And we'll all go home and be back next one. Generally speaking, we ask people to wait with questions until the end. If the speaker is mentioning differently and invite you to ask questions in between, please do so. But hold up your hand, wait for a microphone, so that the online audience, whether it's watching live or recording, can also hear the question. In case that doesn't happen, I'll ask the speakers if they can just repeat the question so that it's clear. If you're watching online, ask questions in Slack or in the YouTube chat. Of course, I want to thank our sponsors as well, our gold sponsor CMD, as well as our silver sponsors Versant and CIFO. And of course, can't forget our venue sponsor NAP, who make sure we sit in this quite wonderful space. I mentioned Slack before. We have a Slack group. It has over 1,000 people in it. Not everybody's active all the time, but we have some interesting channels as well for jobs, for outages, announcements, things like that. Usually when something big happens, a lot of people jump in, or it can be fairly quiet on some days as well. If you want to get involved, we're always looking for speakers. We are opening sponsorships very, very soon for next year. We have yearly sponsorships, so we'll be opening that up soon enough. So reach out if you're interested. And we look for volunteers, people who can help with various small things. Usually, one of the big areas that we're looking for help with is anything graphical, 'cause we're not very good at that. And we want to make things look pretty, but well, I've seen what happens when I try it. So, upcoming events. reInvent is happening in 2 months' time. This is in Las Vegas. Does anybody here know that they're going? No? Yes? One? Cool. If you get the chance to go, definitely go. Otherwise, they want you to register to watch the live streams and stuff, so you can do that for free. If you go in person, it's not cheap. Tickets are $2,100 US, and that's not counting flights and stuff and hotel. So you'll probably be out double that. Closer to home, not many meetups have announced yet for next month. Serverless meetup, I only know because they're being hosted at Mental Group. They'll be on the 19th of October. Don't know the speakers yet. I know they have speakers, but I don't know what the topic is. And that's all from me. So with that, I will invite the gentleman at the back to come forward and tell us all about what's new.
Thank you. All right, let's kick this off with there was probably the big announcement, which was earlier this week, wasn't it?
Yesterday, I think.
Yes, yeah. So Amazon to invest like $4 billion in an AI startup called Anthropic. So
this is to help power. So they've been doing a lot of work with them. If anybody's been keeping up to date with the Bedrock and a lot of the SageMaker Jumpstart machine learning models, a lot of the foundational models that they've been making available. They've been doing a lot of work with this team. Batteries, thank you. So this is a way for Amazon to sort of buy into the company a little bit more, get a little bit more control into the direction. So a lot more collaboration to come, hopefully. Reading some of the strategic stuff, it sounds like this is sort of their answer to Microsoft's investment in OpenAI. So,
yeah, and it should be interesting to see. There's starting to be a lot more sort of trickling out about Bedrock, and so yeah. Watch this space.
Just make sure you've got money. FYI. Bedrock, SageMaker Jumpstarts. They're great. They're easy. Nice. Barrier of entry quite low. Impact on wallet.
Quite high.
Yeah.
All right. So, what's coming to Melbourne?
It's come to Melbourne.
So EC2 serial console. That's not too bad. DNS query logging, Lambda functions.
Graviton 2, Lambda functions. Yee! Cheaper Lambda.
Cheaper Lambdas. And Global Accelerator announced today. So,
Yeah.
Yep. So it's always good.
Not as much love for Melbourne over the last month that it has been previously. But if we look at Sydney got a lot of love this month. Not all of them are particularly exciting. I don't know anybody who's using AWS supply chain. Nobody's playing with that. No, got a lot of head shaking.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's some new stuff, some Connect stuff coming out, some new RDS instances. SES email receiving might be one, but just
Emails are kind of a tricky one because it kind of doesn't, short of like data sovereignty, it doesn't really matter where SES sits because it's kind of a global thing anyway. But yeah, the one interesting one, if you haven't had a chance to play with it, and assuming you've got a use case for it, Amazon Location Services. That's gotten a lot better over the last 12 months. I've actually started using it at home, so it will track as I approach home, so that it will start, turning on the lights and those sorts of bits and pieces for when I get home late. So that just got 75% cheaper, which is nice. Not that it's particularly expensive when there's one person tracking one device, but 75% less of 1 cent is a rounding error.
Databases probably, as with a lot of announcements this month, they're all not a whole lot of standouts. So, Oracle supporting some
New instance sizes.
6i.
New Postgres version. Yay. Hey, RDS Custom, you can now start and stop your instances. Yay. I didn't realize you couldn't do that. So, nice, I guess.
M2 Pro Mac instances. So, yay. If you're doing Mac development that you need to have a Mac on for quite some time, because I think you're still paying for minimum
24 hours per instantiation on all Mac instances. So just keep that in mind. And the M2s are only available in Oregon and North Virginia, I think, is the other one. It's like anything; it'll expand in months to come.
But yeah, as I said, the big gotcha with the Mac instances is it's not a per hour. So if you're doing a long project, it is. But
just be careful because they use the same line as they do for all of the other instances. The billing is per second billing with the price on a per hour basis. It's just that because it's a dedicated instance and because of the licensing for Mac OS and virtualization and those sorts of things, it comes with a minimum of 24 hours billing for every time you turn it on. So, if you're gonna use it, make sure you sort of batch the work, spin it up, use it for 24 hours, and then shut it down, and make sure you sort of minimize the number of times you're turning it on in a month, because I think it works out. I know the M1s are about $35 a day. So yeah. That's why we don't use it to generate this slide pack. That's why we use the Mac on my desk at home. That's why. EMR on Kubernetes. Yay. AppSeek WebSockets, yay. Kendra web crawler, yay. QuickSight, the potentially an interesting multi-tenant setups. You could embed QuickSight in an application, which would be a really nice way for you to be able to do some integrate some BI into your application without having to build the back end or use an open source library or anything like that. That could potentially be interesting.
Some nice
but QuickSight's really expensive. Like for that sort of thing, like even the base model is like $9 a user a month. So like you better be charging your customers a decent slog for, like you ain't going to be giving that away in the free tier.
Containers, app runner improvements for auto scaling.
The obligatory Kubernetes upgrade.
Bottle Rocket, ECS optimized AMIs. CloudWatch, EKS control. Planner's vended logs.
Cool.
Sort of a bit of a theme running through this.
There's a lot of announcements this
stuff.
month, but most of them are pretty fluff. The knowledge base for Bedrock for your local data sources. That's really cool, except for the fact that Bedrock's still on private beta, and so great. The service that you can't use now does more.
Yeah, but at least they're expanding on for anyone that's in that, and then hopefully it gives us those little tidbits that like Bedrock still exists and it's coming out, and where people are doing some things.
Rumor on the grapevine is if you lean on your account manager hard enough, you have a chance of being invited to the beta now. Apparently they are starting. If you can give them a use case, they are
starting to loosen
open to considering you, as opposed to the outright no it's been for the last 3-4 months.
Yeah, it's been pretty tough to even get a look at. Serverless, enhanced error handling with step functions that seem nice. Give you a bit more info on anything that's going wrong.
That hasn't been great. That's sort of been one of Step Function's weaknesses or less desirable things. So I haven't had a chance to play with it. I don't know how much enhanced it is, but potentially could be interesting.
Yeah. SAM CLI, extra support with Terraform. Security, IAM roles anywhere. Now supporting PKCS11 modules.
The worst announcement AWS could have possibly made. Third one down. IAM Identity Center session duration limit increased from 7 to 90 days. This is a prime example of just because AWS let you do something doesn't mean it's a good idea.
Yes, 3 mount points.
Yeah, well, yeah. Look, don't increase the duration limit to 90 days. Having session tokens that last 3 months is never a good idea.
Unless you've got a specific use case. Yeah.
This to me screams the same problem that they had when S3 buckets were public by default. Right? This is a very dangerous thing that a lot of people are going to potentially turn on, and it's going to cause a lot of problems later on down the road when they forget that was left open.
Thankfully, the default is still the still the 7.
Yeah, I think the default hasn't changed, which is fine.
Default is still the 8 hours.
But that's no. Don't do it. Don't do it.
Yeah. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. If you've got a specific use case, okay, but don't leave your credentials idle.
Private CAs for Active Directory, for directory services. Again, this is one of those ones that I can see a use case in enterprise but only if the enterprise has gone down the directory services route without realizing that they're then not going to have that capability, and it feels like a really weird one.
Yeah.
It's cool that you can do it, but it does make directory services a little bit more palatable for large customers now, though.
Yeah. And, the IAM providing the last access information for more services, that's handy for, looking at, what do you need to turn off, what aren't people using. But, this is probably the more interesting slide
out of all of them.
Predominantly for the what not to do.
Yeah. Dev and Ops, You can de-identify outbound messages for SNS. That's potentially really interesting.
Yeah, that was the one that caught my eye as well.
That has got. I can think of a couple of use cases there where you could use that SNS as a part of a pipeline in order to anonymize data as a part of a flow. Yeah, there's something there, and that could be really powerful. Corretto is 21. Yay! We've got to celebrate that one.
AWS backup for Aurora, continuous backup. That's, if you're running that, always good to have that protection and point-in-time recovery.
And the engagement history for every email running through SES, that's a potentially interesting one. SES can be a little bit of it gives you the information in aggregate, but it can be a little bit of a pain in the butt to try and diagnose on a individual transaction basis. So this could be handy from a ops and debugging perspective.
Yeah, and the regex for CloudWatch logs. That could be handy for searching through for data. So,
and then the other fun stuff. I put some Connect stuff in there because Connect. I'm like one of the 7 people in Australia that likes Connect.
The anomaly detection.
Yeah. Connect. Yeah. And then the new. I got to go and do another certification.
Certified data engineer. So, for all those wanting their gold jacket, here's one more cert to get.
Yeah, have fun. So there we are now staring down the barrel of having 4 associate exams. So that'll bring the number back up to 13, if I'm doing my numbers correctly, because we lost 2 last year because we didn't get Alexa Skills Builder, and so Alexa Skills Builder went away, and what was the other one? The data one, the data one, and then we had so we went from 14 to 12, and now we're back up to 13. So,
so
that's it. That was a relatively boring month. These are going to get pretty anemic for the next couple of months. We've all played the game before. We know that we start getting into a little bit of a quiet period as we approach reInvent. AWS keeps its good stuff for all of the department heads to announce on main stage. But yeah, we'll see how we go.
It'll be interesting to see what happens with pre-invent, because I think last year they actually announced some decent stuff.
They announced a bunch of stuff ahead of time, but we'll see.
We'll see. All right, that's
it.
us.
Thank you, Matt and Jason. And yes, that means we'll get a lot of, not much next month, and hopefully more the month after. But with that, I would like to invite our first speaker, Colin. Colin Andrews is a senior consultant at CMD and Mantle Group, where he specializes in developing AWS landing zones using the latest technologies and best practices.
Hey, how's it going? My name's Colin. Thanks so much to Ian and Matt and the guys for inviting me along this evening. I'm going to talk to you about AWS IAM and set theory. So the intersection of technology and mathematics, and there's a little set theory joke in there for you straight off the bat, right? I think the most important question we can really ask at the top, right at the top, is why? Why do this? Why am I putting you through this? And I think to answer that question, we kind of have to go back in time a little bit. You might have to indulge me for a couple of minutes. My background is not straight into technology. I didn't jump into like a computer science degree when I left high school. Instead, I went and studied mathematics at Monash University, and specifically like pure maths. So I was interested in real analysis, topology, number theory, stuff that was as far removed from computers as I could possibly get. And I stayed that way for quite a number of years until I discovered the wonder of Excel, and I was like, oh, actually, maybe computers are pretty cool. Maybe you can do some interesting things with them. We'll just see what this is about. But I think like what I want to share with you is one of the most like critical learnings from my stint at Monash. Which is this. It was from a lecturer that I really enjoyed. He's a guy called Burkhard. He has a great YouTube channel called Mathologer. If you guys want to check that out, there's a guy called Burkhard. He shared this with me. He said, if you're at a party and you want to tell a joke about mathematics, first what you do is you gather everyone into a room and then you lock all the doors. So that's why this is happening to you right now, because some guy who's got this strange connection between mathematics and technology is standing on stage. And I got quite interested in in my technological journey, where's the overlaps? Like, you know, a lot of tools and technologies we use are built on theories from mathematics, but it's kind of interesting to see where like the raw maths shows up in our day-to-day lives. So that kind of answers why from a maths perspective, but from a technology perspective, as Ian said, I'm a consultant at a company called CMD and Mantle Group, and there I specialize in landing zones. AWS landing zones specifically. So this is how you build and configure AWS environments that can scale, using best practices. So a little bit of a slide over here. Here we go. Here's an AWS organization. It's got some accounts in it. It's got some org units in it. You use some service called Control Tower, whatever that is, to build it out. Best practices and all this sort of thing. Interesting tools and technologies. Like in my day-to-day, I spend a lot of time thinking about how to best use this service and how to service the needs of like clients of various scales. So this is quite a small organization. You've got like one account at the top, which is your management account that kind of coordinates things, and then you've got some, security accounts, and you've got some workload accounts. But some organizations, huge, have massive amounts of accounts, like 800 plus I've seen. It's crazy. It's lots. And if you're, no matter what stage of your journey you're at in building out an AWS organization, one of the things you're always thinking about is identity and access management. So who is it that can get into my accounts? What can they do in there? And like how? How do they get in? And how do they have a good time? So in particular, like one of the things I'm interested in kind of is like early stages usages of AWS, right? So you got a nice happy group of developers over there. You want to let them loose in your developer account, and you'll do this using a service called IAM Identity Center, or SSO, whatever you'd like to call it. And through this service, it's combined with Control Tower, you get to write policies that say, hey, yeah, Dev, you can go and build EC2s and put stuff in S3 buckets and go have a great time. In fact, you can write policies that let them have access to all sorts of wonderful things that AWS has to offer. And I think what's really challenging is we're always confronted with this like specter of least privilege. Oh, like should you really let everyone do all this stuff? Should you? should you just maybe scope it down a little bit, just to the services that you need? I think this is a challenging, place to put organization like platform admins in. Say like, yeah, there's 200 plus AWS services. I don't know what they're all for. Like, there's a lot of them. I'm only interested in a subset of them, really. But like, my developers might be interested in a lot of them. So how do I give them the flexibility to explore and have fun and come up with business value, whilst safeguarding them from perhaps the things that we could be aware are a lot more dangerous to interact with. So this is where let's talk about like the first two policies that you might run into that are extremely useful, that I think everybody uses all of the time for developer access. These are read-only access and power user access. Now, yes, there are code snippets on screen. There's going to be a lot of pictures, lots and lots of pictures, I promise you that. There's very few of these, mostly pictures. What's interesting about like read-only access, I'm sure everybody has used a read-only access role before or policy before, is an absolutely freaking giant JSON file. This is 1,600 lines long of every single service you can possibly imagine, and all of the read-only functions that are associated with that service. Now, one thing I kind of didn't mention up the top is, yes, I wrote a blog post about all of this stuff, so you can go and read that later. And what I want to call out during this talk is all the things I got wrong in the blog post. So in particular, when it comes to this read-only thing, I said explicitly that we're listing in specific actions in read-only that are here. But what you'll see actually, if I do a nice little one of these guys, is this going to work? It's not going to work. Oh no. Is that? Yeah, is it on screen? It is on screen. Yeah, okay, laser pointers, fancy. That there's a little asterisk hanging out next to all of these things. And I want you to pay attention to that asterisk because that's a very important little function when it comes to writing IAM policies. Effectively, what it does is groups similar things together, so groups of stuff. And you see it occurring over here in the power user access policy. Now, I love the power user access policy because it grants you almost all of the same actions that read-only does, right? So all of those 1,600 lines, plus all of the right actions that you could possibly want as a developer in AWS. And what I want to call out is, what I want to call out is a couple of things. One, it's only 25 lines long, so it's not 1,600 lines. But somehow, in 25 lines, they explain all of those 1,600 things plus more. And then I want to draw your attention to a particular difference between them. So these are both what you call allow statements. So that's what effect allow means at the top here. But the key difference between them is really this action and not action statement here. So read only says, effect, allow all the stuff in this list, right? And the power user policy on the other side says, allow all the stuff not in this list. So take all the stuff that's not in the list and give it to me, right? Now, as a mathematician, when I start seeing these inverses appearing, so action versus not action, in versus out, like one set of things and then the opposite set of things, my math senses start tingling. Whoa. Ooh, there's some logic that might appear here. Who knows where it might take us? And why is it showing up in AWS IAM like policies as well? Whoa, what's going on here? So from this, we kind of make a somewhat tangential jump into set theory, right? And we're going to try and use it to understand how writing policies can be fun, and how you can make them very useful, and utilize the logic that we're learning kind of from this power user policy and expand it into sort of other potentially very interesting and honestly mostly academic sort of ways, but we'll see. We'll have a good time, I promise. So set theory, very easy to learn. which is good. So we're going to learn the basics of set theory, and then we're going to try and write policies using some of the concepts. So everyone knows set theory. It's about Venn diagrams. That's pretty much it. People who like math, people who like tech, people who are fun at parties in the middle there. Hey? Yeah. All right. Set theory is kind of concerned with describing groups of objects and then thinking about how you might talk about the relationships between different groups. So it's also where the memes happen. But yeah, like this is pretty much it in a nutshell. You get to some circles, you talk about the relationships between them. So let's do that in a bit more detail. So you get things called set operations. So we're going to start at the top here, and we'll learn all of the set operations that set theory has to offer, and then later we'll go into some actual like theories that apply to them. So borrowed directly from maths. So at the top, you've got a piece of paper. It contains two circles, A and B, and what you're trying to do is say, how do I describe the whole sheet of paper with respect to A and B? So at the top left, we go stuff that's in A, cool. Top right, we say stuff that's not in A. So this is the complement of A. This is where that power user kind of stuff was showing up just before. So this is describing the opposite of a set of things. Down the bottom, on the left, we've got things that are in both A and B. So this is called the intersection of two sets. So common elements between them. Now, then you have the union as well. So this is stuff in both A and B. Now you can have as many sets as you want, and you can always think about intersections and unions of them. So you can have infinitely many sets and talk about the intersection between them, or the unions of them, or the complements of sets. In the middle, there's some interesting edge cases, because these things definitely happen in real life. You have disjoint sets. So if you were to take the intersection of those, they don't overlap, there's nothing in them, right? So that would be empty. And then you have a proper subset here where B is wholly contained in A. So these are the, there it is. You've done a maths degree. Congrats, well done. So let's now think about, now that we know all about set theory, just generally in the kind of maths world, and can make some pretty kick-ass memes, let's move on and learn about sets in IAM. So what I want to introduce you guys to is a thing that I like to call the IAM permission space. Here it is. It's a big piece of paper. It's full of dots. Dots represent all of the possible actions that you could perform in AWS. So like S3 put object, or EC2 create instance, or something like that, right? And there's zillions of them. There's lots and lots and lots of dots on this sheet of paper. What's important to note is that there are, at any one point in time, a finite number of actions. So there's not infinitely many actions in AWS. This seems, this is obvious, but I just feel like it's worth calling out, because we're not like, you can do set theory on infinite sets, and that's really fun, if you think about numbers. We're not thinking about numbers, we're just thinking about a big list of strings, effectively, and it's a big finite list of strings. I mean, that's not to say that they're not going to release new services or features at any point in time and maybe ruin all of your policies because they've changed the way that IAM or actions work, but I think that's important to note. So another way to think about the IAM permission space is to group it all together. So like we saw in the power user policy, you kind of describe sets in the permission space by thinking about maybe like the prefixes that are associated with them. So all of the IAM actions are prefixed with IAM, and they go in that little circle over there. And they're very distinct from all of the S3 actions that are prefixed with S3 and go in the little circle over there. And and in policy, well, actually, a few things I want to mention. One, there are currently like 384 service prefixes in AWS, which is a lot. Like, it's a lot of things to try and understand. I don't think there are 384 services, but some services have more than one prefix. So Identity Center, for example, has like 3. So there's 3 different sets of actions that are associated with that service. when it comes to describing subsets of the permission space, we get to do this in IAM policies by using the action and not action key. So the what goes in that little list in our policy ends up being a set of actions. So you could write exclusively or explicitly list out the actions that you want in a list and call like, hey, this is my set. Or you can use these asterisks as wildcards that I was talking about earlier and kind of like expand a little bit. So you use a bit of logic to say, actually, I'm interested in having all IAM actions described in my list. Alrighty, so let's have a look at the read-only access, power user access in terms of like sets. So what we've got here is read-only access is a great example of an allow actions. So it says, here's a list of actions, here's a set of actions. I want to allow those, only those in my particular policy. So we have like effect allow and then some set. So that's indicated here by the orange bit being in the read-only access. So allowed actions are in orange over there. And then on the right-hand side, we have the complement of IAM actions, organizations actions, and account actions being allowed by the power user access. So that's saying allow not this list of actions, right? So you kind of invert outwards here and get access to a lot more different sort of functions. So this is, picking a set, picking the complement of a set. We could start thinking about how we describe intersections of sets in the permission space, right? How we describe unions of sets in the permission space. Now, what's tricky, if I flip back a slide, is not all, it's hard to kind of think of some sets that have intersections. So for example here, like IAM shares no common actions with amplifier, for example, right? Like you won't find any actions that are shared in those two sets. So you're kind of like, oh, okay, well, if I wanted I'd have to construct some set list of actions and some other list of actions and like manufacture it so that there were shared common elements and then I could think about like intersections and unions of those two sets. But actually, instead of doing that, what we're going to do is something else. Now, what I really need is some water. Just 1 second. Talking. Oof. Taking that out. Alrighty. So, as I was saying, we could start thinking about intersections and unions in the permission space, but writing policies isn't actually about describing actions, right? It's a part of writing policies, but the interesting thing is granting permissions. So you describe actions in order to grant or deny permissions for users or roles inside of your AWS accounts and environments, right? So it's about the logic of granted permissions. So I am allowed to do the stuff in the read-only access little circle. I'm allowed to do the stuff that's not in that IAM actions, organizations, and account circle. So let's talk about the logic of granted permissions in AWS. Whew. Who's seen this before? Yeah, fun. Oh, great time. Really good diagram. This is it. This is AWS's policy evaluation logic. Absolute beast. Whenever you do something in AWS, this diagram is kind of the process that is followed to decide whether or not you're allowed to do a thing. You know, funnily enough, for this talk, we're pretty much exclusively thinking about the first column, and the rest of it we're just going to helpfully ignore. But what I want to call out is you don't just write IAM policies on the left-hand side, as they apply to users or roles, you also write SEPs, you also write permission boundaries. All of these things are written in the same syntax, and the same logic will apply to them later on. But for us, we're just interested in this stuff all the way on the very left-hand side. So evaluate some policies. Is there a deny? Yes or no? Now, we can, instead of like going through all of the steps, let's just simplify it a whole lot, kind of conceptually. We're going to think about this policy evaluation logic as a function. So input goes in, some logic happens, output comes out. And what's really interesting is like this drastically simplifies when you just think about it as, am I allowed to do this, yes or no? Right? So one input goes in, only two outputs are ever possible. Yes, you're allowed to do a thing. No, you're not allowed to do a thing. And you know what happens when mathematicians start hearing functions? Their math senses start tingling again. So not only is it set theory showing up, but it's also like functional logic stuff happening as well. So let's learn about functions in mathematics, and then we'll tie it back around into why this is useful in set theory. So we'll leave all this behind. Much simpler, much better. Okay. Yeah, let's learn about functions. Here are two sets. They're not of anything in particular. I just like the shapes. And in maths, a function describes a map between two sets. Right? So how you get from stuff in A to stuff in B. Now this could be any kind of like logical statement that you make. You could think about like what happens to all of the things in A when they get mapped over to B. Does it cover all of B? Does it cover only a small part of B? Does nothing happen? Yeah, it's just kind of that's all a function is in maths, really. Congrats again, you just passed another degree. Well done. But there's a few important rules that functions follow, and here they are. So functions maps between two sets. And importantly, they are allowed to do the thing at the top, which is to take two distinct items from set A and put them onto a single item in set B. You're allowed to do that if you're a function. What you're not allowed to do if you're a function is take one item from set A and map it onto two distinct things in set B. Now, why is this relevant to us? Sorry if I've lost the plot and started rambling about functions. Because, like I said before, the policy evaluation logic in AWS can be thought of as a function, and policies themselves, so IAM policies as you write them, are also functions. Here they are, right? So here I've got the IAM permission space, and I've written some policy which says allow things in EC2, deny things in S3, and I don't care about the rest of the permission space. And what you see happening is, as users go and try to use this policy, it's mapped from the permission space onto what I call the allow-deny set. So this is another set now. So it's only got two elements. It's like, yes, you can do something. No, you can't do something. That's the end. And a policy is a functional map between bits in the permission space and this allow-deny set. Right? Now, the reason why I bring all this up is because when it comes to talking about intersections and unions of policies in the permission space, we're not actually so much interested in whether or not some set you can describe in a list like shares common elements, right? So suppose you said allow EC2 and allow S3, like we're not really bothered like what's in those things. What we're more interested in is whether the functional evaluation of the policy ends up with the desired result. Okay, so bear with me. Here we go. Like, let's walk through it again. So we've seen set complements before. You've got some list of actions. And you're saying, oh yes, okay, sorry. Just had to look at the old notes here. So with set complements, what this has to do with this functional thing that I've been banging on about is we're not only interested in finding some way to describe the complementary set of actions in the permission space, so like flipping around from this orange circle to this like more orange square. We're also interested in whether or not, the functional evaluation. So whether or not the evaluation of of like a complementary set yields some result that we're interested in. So for example, you've got some list of actions on the left. There are two ways to come up with the result on the right. You could say, you could do the power user access thing and say, allow not this list of actions, and then that would yield a complementary kind of set thing going on. Or you could get out a pen and paper and manually list all of the actions in AWS to the exclusion of the actions in your list. So you have one small list and one giant list that says you can do all of this stuff. So there's two ways to achieve this little box on the right. So to think about set complements. So when we come over to set unions now, there are a couple ways to think about set unions in the permission space. So if you're writing policies, suppose you want to allow EC2 and S3 actions, there's a couple ways to do this and end up with the union of these two sets. So one is to just plonk both of these sets of actions in the same list. You could also write two different policies, one that allows EC2, one that allows S3, apply them both to the IAM role, and then you get the same result here, which is nice. You could have them in two different statements as well. What's interesting is that this is actually also the second place thing that I got wrong in the article, because you can think about what if I wanted to describe like the set of not actions, not EC2 actions. So think about all the stuff that's not EC2, and think about all the stuff here that's not S3. And what if I wanted to write a policy that allowed the union of those two sets, right? If I were to say not action here, where I've got this little, I can do the laser pointer again. If I said not action here, I'd just end up actually with the white stuff, right? But if you think logically, the union of not EC2 and not S3 is actually all of the permission space. So you have to watch out. There's some tricks that you can run into. And I think appreciating how set unions work in the permission space actually more useful when it comes to writing SCPs and permissions boundaries, because there you're thinking about describing large chunks of the permission space and trying to carve out pits that you really don't want people to act in. When it comes to IAM roles and policies, it's more just for fun. Okay, so let's get on to the excellent one. This is oh my goodness, I've been talking for frickin' ages. Excuse me, just realized. Okay, set intersections. This is the really fun one. So like I said, been said a number of times, it's not super easy to come up with just like lists of actions that share elements in common, but that's not going to stop us from using our brains and our logic to just come up with a scenario, wave your hands in the air and say, oh yeah, this is the logic of how it works. So suppose that we have two lists of actions that describe some sets in the permission space, and that they do share elements in common. There is a method you can employ to write a policy such that you end up only allowing the intersection, which is that bit in the middle there. So the first thing that you do, it's a two-part process. The first thing that you do is you say, just allow the actions that happen in A, right? That's cool. Doesn't give us the result that they want. Gives it most of the sum of the result, which is this bit in here. But then we end up with all this extra stuff that we don't want to allow for some bizarre mathsy reason. So the second part, and this comes back to our functional evaluation thing, the second part is to simply deny everything that's not in B, right? So think about this for a second. If I've got stuff in B and I just deny all the rest of this stuff, then what am I left with? Ooh, There's the intersection. Oh, that's a fun, nice little satisfying dink there. Now, when does this actually become useful? Well, that remains to be seen. Let's I'll just speed right along and come to a bit of a conclusion. So, I think to draw it back to granting your developers access to your lower environments to play around and have fun. Having an appreciation for like the logic of how these policies are written and how like the sorts of things you can describe with this action and not action and affect, allow, and deny keywords is really useful. So I want to share with you something that I like to call the modified power user policy. This is just like a bit more of a slightly more restricted version of the regular power user policy, and it goes a little something like this. So it's made up of 3 bits instead of just the regular 2 bits. First, you start off with this white circle, which I call the restricted actions list. So you describe a set of like, well, you've done some analysis of AWS and you're like, hey, I think these services are like cool, but they're kind of dangerous, right? Like organizations and IAM, if you have access to those, you can do admin level things and that might like, goof around a bit, but they're still useful for developers. They might want to like query their account number or list IAM roles. That's a valid thing that you might want to do. So you say, cool, for all the services that I do understand and I want to restrict the sort of actions that my devs can perform in them, I'll put them in this restricted actions list, which is the white circle. So I'm saying allow not this sort of stuff. Then you perform some analysis and you say, but these actions are allowed. So this is my little yellow circle in the middle here. So you say these are restricted actions list. So I said, like, I want them to list IAM roles. I want them to like list and create instances, but I don't want them to destroy my VPCs. So I'll just kind of leave that chunk out in this first statement. And then if you really hate Amplify, Cognito, Sync, and GameLift, you can put them in a denied services policy and just cancel them out of the permission space as well. So modified power user. I think this is a particularly nice and neat method for allowing like a wide range of actions in your lower environments, rather than just like having one big allow list that says allow all these 100 services and all these individual ones. You just be like, cool, this is still only like 50 lines or less. That's good. It's nice and efficient. Now, I've just hit over 30 minutes, and I'm going to wrap it up. But I was going to talk to you about more nerdy stuff, but I'm not going to. Thank you very much for having me. Cheers.
Thank you, Colin. I think we have time for one quick question. If somebody has a question they want to ask now, otherwise just bother Colin afterwards.
That'd be great.
Yep. Cool. Thank you, Colin. That was a great talk. And that means it's time for our second speaker. Rinaldi is a software engineer from Seek Limited, where he works on the infrastructure which powers the homepage of the site. Previously, he has worked as a .NET software developer and has been active within the research community, putting a lot of his research focus within IoT and virtual reality. He's also an AWS community builder, an SME for AWS certifications, and currently holds all AWS certifications. Somebody has some work ahead of them next month. Having spoken at over 30 events and conferences, he has also been active on the open source community for the past 6 years, building solutions on the cloud and sharing his experiences and projects. He aims to build open source solutions which can both help people achieve more value in what they do and promote best practices for fellow developers. And I'm sure you introduce yourself even more. So, thank you all. And
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So, as introduced by Aryan, I'm Rinaldi, and today I'll be giving this talk, building an anonymous chat forum on AWS from idea to development. So I'll introduce this topic a bit more, but I'll just give a pretty much quick agenda as well, pretty much. So today we're just going to be talking about like why we essentially want to build like our own anonymous forum, like, and pretty much talk about architecture, talk about the back implementation, talk about the front implementation, and finally, just more or less just talk about the challenges, considerations, and what does it look like for the future. And before that, just gonna give another quick introduction, pretty much. So again, I'm Rinaldi, as introduced as well before. So yeah, pretty much more or less the information's pretty much already summed up as well. But yeah, just including it again, pretty much just for for reference point. And so let's get into this directly. Let's talk about the why. Why do we want a new kind of like social platform essentially that is anonymous? So firstly, let me kind of like get a quick poll around the room. Who has been a fan of the recent transition from Twitter to X? No show of hands? Well, I'm quite a advocate as well for not supporting it actually, but essentially, as with this talk as well, you already know as well that, yeah, I'm not exactly the biggest fan too. And pretty much it got me thinking one day, like, you know what, like, what if we can actually encourage more thoughts, more development and community for essentially like a new platform, a new kind of like, I don't know, maybe create a new Twitter essentially that, you know, isn't exactly like going to an endless spiral of who knows what's going into right now. But anyway, we want to essentially be able to create a safe space where we're able to interchange ideas somewhat as well, like what Twitter did as well before, and pretty much with a lot of like social platforms as well. But at the same time, consider privacy too. Consider privacy considerations, because privacy has been an issue that has been talked about for decades in the social media space, in regards to how people are essentially going to approach this particular situation. So as part of that, why not go anonymous? What if we can create a solution where people can actually essentially do things anonymously while actually more or less being able to communicate ideas freely as well? And that's pretty much like where I got the idea pretty much to try and attempt to build something on AWS that essentially can serve as a foundation for this. So more or less, we're going to be going into a bit of a deep dive directly. So more or less, these are just kind of like a simple structure. So today I've been kind of more or less talking about this more or less in a kind of like a simplistic, like high-level overview. But we're going to be getting into deep a bit of code as well. But I'm going to pretty much try to keep it more or less on the fundamentals of the CRUD operations that we need to do as part of creating this particular website essentially. So as I can see from this, like these are pretty much like the expected backend requests pretty much that you would expect from such an app. So pretty much, yeah, like we're building this, as you can tell, pretty much based on Node. So you can see that pretty much we're just doing like, yeah, app.get's pretty much like, yeah, app-get thread, app-get post, pretty much, yeah, and pretty much like, so we need to five main operations, like pretty much like the main ones, excluding delete, of course, and update, is pretty much like getting the threads and getting the posts, essentially. So we want to be able to get the threads and post to create a new thread, as well as to be able to create a new post within the thread, and also be able to get the thread post within the thread. So that's essentially what we want to be able to get out of this. So this is just a once implementation, for example, what we're currently essentially like how we do it, for example, within the Node space pretty much. So yeah, just kind of like more or less a quick implementation on the backend side, more or less, to be able to get the get and the post. And yeah, just pretty much a bit more as well. And as you can see, we're pretty much just like sending requests on the Node side to be able to get these Node requests. And I'll talk a bit about as well like how we host this as well later on too, because previously what was done here is that it is hosted on EC2, and pretty much scaling a bit more, we then changed it to something else. So pretty much it's just right now it's more or less just kind of like a preview of like what it used to be, and after this I'm going to get into the architecture as well. So originally, it was based on RDS. That was originally where I decided to put the database in. So as you can see, I structured it this way. So more or less, two simple tables within the RDS, posts and threads. So this is essentially the main fundamentals of having an actual platform, essentially. So more or less just having a post, what's the ID, what's the content, what's the thread ID as well that's connected to the thread, user ID, who created the post, and what time was it created at. Similar for threads as well. We have an ID, we have title, we have the content, and we have pretty much a user ID also created at as well. So previously, we more or less had the architecture based on EC2s, essentially. So what was done before was essentially the API gateway pretty much was connected to EC2, essentially. So basically, the API gateway would be connected to a load balancer, which essentially then scaled up EC2s as well as part of that too. And what the load balancer did then was essentially connect to Lambda functions, one of which then sent requests to the AWS Secrets Manager. And also, I think my face is covering that in there, but it's pretty much connected to RDS. So essentially, we're essentially getting the data from RDS, the database basically. But what now is being done essentially is that it has been transitioned now towards being able to use DynamoDB instead. And so basically, how I'll explain a bit about like the structure currently. So more or less, we have the front end, which has React as a front end. We pretty much like host the website on S3, have a static website, and more or less do the authentication based on Cognito and Amplify. Setting up the authentication with Amplify automatically sets up Cognito and pretty much just sends pretty much like requests to Amplify whenever a user logs in, and selectively displays content based on that, based on their login or not. And yeah, pretty much as part of that, then that gets requests then are forwarded to API gateway, and pretty much then requests are then forwarded as well from API gateway to AWS Lambda. So have a Lambda function, which then is able to retrieve secrets from the backend. And I'll talk a bit more about why we're using Secrets Manager in this particular case scenario. But after that, pretty much what we then do is pretty much go from Lambda to be able to fetch the data that we need from DynamoDB. And because why DynamoDB? Well, because it's scalable essentially, and we want to be basically like reduce costs particularly, and particularly we want to be able to pay as we go. So it's much more efficient essentially than using RDS over time. So why do we manage secrets? Two things. Originally for RDS, because previously we did use RDS, and now pretty much we're using DynamoDB, so not as important, but also because we were also pretty much like experimenting a bit as well with pretty much using for the ChatGPT API, for example. So it's not going to be in today's talk, but the ChatGPT API was something that I feel like is, well, it doesn't even have to be ChatGPT API. Like a lot of API keys can be just stored there as well. But I'm using this particular example as well because like one of the things that was being experimented as well was within moderation as well of content too with ChatGPT, and I'll get into that a bit later as well, along with the concerns of ethics as well, along with that too. But it's definitely something that has been experimented as well. And so with authentication with Amplify, there are three main things pretty much that is being done. So originally, it was set up so that the site was able to use authentication in form of email and password. So pretty much basic, because yeah, pretty much just trying to set up the basic authentication first and just making sure that, yeah, security was essentially there. And yeah, pretty much after that, working with Cognito to be able to then register the names and pretty much like how the user can log into, so to be able to, yeah, pretty much like allow the user to record pretty much the name as well that we can actually kind of like associate the user by to when we then display pretty much the username. And afterwards, we then extract JWT tokens for authentication. So these are essentially JSON tokens pretty much that you're able to pretty much get from the front end. And what we do then is that every time a user sends a request, it sends the JWT token to the back end to be able to authenticate that you are the user who is currently authenticated to actually see that. And this helps with a lot of things such as SQL injection and quite a number of like security concerns, particularly in regards to, for example, users trying to put data that they, to be able to like disguise themselves as someone else and try to put data into the payload that they shouldn't, and pretty much like get through as well that way too. So using JWT tokens has been one of the great things, particularly that has been good for the project to be able to quickly maneuver these particular security concerns. And what we then do pretty much is that we also create a auth context file, and particularly an auth context file in this case scenario is more or less just used to more or less create a React context essentially in this case scenario. And pretty much like what we're just trying to do is more or less like create a global, for those who are not too familiar with React, we're just more or less trying to create a global authentication provider with this context. And particularly in this case scenario, we want to be able to more or less help with the authentication throughout the site, and more or less just create this particular context file to be able to use this particular context and essentially authenticate the user throughout the pages when they're logged in. So how do we then go about routing in the front end? Pretty much, so pretty much like we do a bit of routing on the app.js. So in this particular case scenario, we're more or less just pretty much like setting a theme, setting the user as well based on the authentication, as mentioned before as well from the use context. So after that, we then want to be able to check if the user authenticated. So pretty much like we have a current authenticated user code there too. And I'll demonstrate as well like why we have a theme too. The theme pretty much is an optional thing that I was playing around with too, but it's not exactly a fundamental component of the website, but definitely something I feel that you all will find interesting too. And as a part 2 as well, then after that pretty much just more or less like returning the particular paths as well, like returning the login, sign up, threads as well, that to be able to display it. So as soon as you pretty much like log in, you'll see the threads directly become displayed, which is pretty much like the behavior that we actually want more or less. So we want also to see all the threads displayed in the home page as soon as we log in. And that being said, we want to be able to display the threads while also hiding pretty much the threads that are hiding the ability to be able to modify or create posts that the users are not logged in. So let's talk a bit about scalability and availability. So a few things about this. These are pretty much some stuff that have been pretty much like put into place as well. But pretty much what we can do pretty much to try to scale this and make it available over a number of regions as well is pretty much firstly using CloudFront distribution to distribute particularly within APAC regions. So CloudFront distributions offer the ability pretty much for you to be able to distribute it to different parts of the world, but in this case scenario, it's just being limited to APAC regions because, well, limiting cost, and it's pretty much just a trial after all. It's a passion project, so not exactly looking to like spread it globally yet, but pretty much and after that, load balancing between the EC behind the EC2. So there are really two ways of implementing this, as mentioned before. Like firstly, like true load balancing EC2s, pretty much connecting it forwarding requests from the API gateway to the EC2s. Or pretty much in this case scenario, Lambda. I choose the latter particularly firstly because of cost management, and secondly because it's a pay as you goes, and thirdly because we want pretty much like go serverless more or less. So it's definitely, I feel like in this particular case scenario, a better choice. And after that, using a Route 53 to pretty much like host the domain particularly, which then routes the requests accordingly through the CloudFront distribution as well. So what are the challenges that have been seen from this? So there are 5 main challenges. Firstly, that can be foreseen is data privacy and security. This is one of the things that was taken into account very carefully as well when I was designing the app too. So it was really, I feel, more or less just thinking about how potential people might try to go into the payload, SQL injection, and all that particularly, as well as how to handle the data as well. So, though we don't get in deep waters. So it's definitely one of the things that have been talked about as well for a lot of social medias for over quite some time too. Content moderation is another thing too. One of the things I particularly envision that I initially tried yet, I don't have like a wholly working demo for the content moderation side of things yet though, but it's definitely something that I've tried. It's basically kind of like more or less like having actually ChatGPT try to more or less do content moderation. It always turns out a bit interesting whenever you kind of like try that because well, it's never really consistent, but I do believe that at some point it definitely will be a very interesting thing to go into, and I'll definitely play around more of that as well, like once Bedrock comes out too, with different AI models too. Compliance, of course, and aside from that, also in terms of backup and recovery, and because of course, like we want to be able to create a backup system that can both be management friendly, but also pretty much robust enough so that we can essentially restore our data quickly whenever users are trying to get through it. And fifth, finally, monitoring and management. How are we particularly trying to visualize these particular data on, for example, like CloudWatch or your monitoring providers as well, and pretty much like how are we getting the insights as well of, you know, like pretty much like how users are interacting with the site, and pretty much how we're more or less like monitoring like if there are adverse activities happening. So these are pretty much the 5 main challenges. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna go into the fun part, which is basically just a bit of demo time. Now, hopefully, this all goes well and nothing breaks. Let's see. What if I do this? Sorry, do you know how to switch the screen to another tab? Another window? That's all good. I'm not 100% sure as well, but
Can you drag it there?
let me see if I can do that. Oh, cool. Thank you. Yep. So let's see if that works. Now I have to find my cursor. Beautiful. Okay. Yep. So pretty much as an example, pretty much of like more or less like the implementation. And as you can see, I have my dev inspect console up. Let's just close that. So more or less, this is a very, very pretty much like bare bones implementation still pretty much. So yeah, haven't done too much UI yet, but the important thing pretty much I thought was just having the working concept first, more or less, of like what it would look like essentially, and pretty much have it host serverless. So as you can see, more or less what we have here is pretty much and one quick thing I have to get out of the way first, and as I was mentioning before, I will pretty much like mention about why we have a theme in pretty much the app.js, and this is why. So as you can see, we have a dark mode and more or less a light mode particularly as well. So as you can see, what we have then is, then try this off, hold on. Let me just connect. Sorry about that. I think, let me just connect to my hotspot. All right, cool. Yep, and now we can do this again. Oops. Let's see. We do this. Beautiful. All right, and pretty much like as we can see, we have more or less, like as I was mentioning, like dark mode, light mode. Well, I'm sure that everyone here as a developer can agree that that's a very important thing to pretty much have as a feature. And yeah, pretty much aside from that, what we want to do then is to be able to more or less like have posts. So as we can see, for example, we have like the thread popping up. So I designed this particularly as a single page React app essentially. So as you can see, pretty much we have the content, we have more or less, you're able to write posts here particularly. So yeah, for example, like we can go to another topic. We can go to like, for example, the topic like what is serverless? Yeah. And pretty much let's just, yeah, pretty much like add another response there, like hello. And yeah, particularly so basically, as you can see, more or less, we have the user displayed message and pretty much a timestamp as well that we want as well. And aside from that, we can always create new threads as well. Yeah, pretty much more or less just, yeah, normal stuff. Just create title, content. So yeah, regular stuff pretty much. And yeah, that pretty much is most of the demo. So let me just, yeah, bring that back. And now let's see if I can refocus this now. Yep. Let's see, bring that back and go into presentation mode again. All right. So what are some future developments? Well, I didn't put it here as well, but yeah, the UI needs development. It's pretty much like a bare bones, as I mentioned before. It's pretty much still in a state where, yeah, like more development is needed on making sure the UI is more intuitive, making it more, yeah, easier to grasp essentially. But for the purpose of this particular time, I made it pretty much just like, yeah, based on like pure CRUD operations and more or less just more demonstrating like how the backbone can be built on AWS. And of course, there's going to be other features implemented as well, but more or less, it's just kind of like a backbone demonstration for now. But yeah, as I was mentioning before as well, I would love to be able to use AI more here as well, which is, for example, as I mentioned before, in terms of, for example, like an advanced moderation, which one of the things that I feel like would be very interesting to see how it goes over time too. By no means, I don't think like AI will be a good moderator. It's, well, there's the potential, but there's always the potential for bias too, which one of the things I've seen in ChatGPT a lot too. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how it develops as well. Like, for example, like the model, like I know like ChatGPT 4 has been much better in moderation I've seen compared to like 3.5. So it's very interesting to see that. And aside from that, of course, yeah, developing a mobile app, of course, would be a great thing. It's something I'm, yeah, pretty much like trying out on my own time as well. It's not exactly, I'm not a mobile dev, but it's definitely something I'm, yeah, trying to get on as well, trying to experiment that side of things as well. And aside from that, really, the possibility to provide like educational content as well is also interesting as well, particularly within this case scenario as well. Educational content in terms of more or less like better practice as well, like how you can pretty much like help people within the community as well, or community-based posts as well. Like it can pretty much like help as well, or bring, for example, like threads as well or posts as well that can actually help out the community too. Maybe like in terms of like, yeah, for example, like the AWS community, helping, yeah, sharing insights and such, and providing educational insights. And of course, in terms of accessibility is one thing as well. It's something definitely that I feel like is very important for a lot of designs for web apps and in general. So it's very important as well, I feel, to look into too. So what are the key takeaways? Making an anonymous form is actually not that hard. You pretty much just need to be able to, like, more or less, like, make sure the main CRUD operations function over the AWS infrastructure, and more or less just have the whole our architecture pretty much like built off, and pretty much like work with a front end and a back end interface, and you should be good. So it's pretty much just a bit of figuring out pretty much, and a bit of nicky picky pretty much with the IAM permissions, and of course cores as well. If you're a web dev, I'm sure you pretty much have already struggled with cores too. Yeah, it's one of the things that I feel like I've always pretty much like played around with as well, and have also experienced the horrors of as well. So yeah, cores can be quite an interesting thing. But aside from that, pretty much, yeah, like consider as well, like also availability, scalability, and security. Like whenever designing these kinds of apps, like how are you catering towards your users? How are you particularly, more or less, are you able to scale accordingly as well, according to the demand? And this is still pretty much a very basic implementation. Like when it comes to like, yeah, of course, like when it comes to like bigger apps, like, yeah, like Twitter or like Facebook, like, yeah, there's definitely more considerations to go about that. And of course, like you would have to put a platform distribution of like across, you know, globally instead of just like APAC, for example. And considering you're going serverless or not, this time around, I'm going pretty much like with Lambdas, particularly just because I want to make it serverless and more cost efficient, particularly. But there may be other cases that you could actually make an argument for not going serverless. Like, for example, we are originally, like, I did choose RDS because I actually feel that the schema was actually quite defined. Like, it wasn't going to really change much, and there wasn't to actually kind of like make the call for a NoSQL. So RDS actually fit pretty well, but yeah, pretty much like cost management wise, I feel like pretty much like in the end of the day, and to go more on like a pay as you go basis, pretty much like Lambda ended up like being the better option. And yeah, more contribution to open source. I hope there will be definitely more into that, and maybe we'll see our like first like open source Twitter. You never know. And of course, yeah, maybe grow up to be the next X. So yeah. And that is all from me. Thank you. And yeah, hope everyone enjoyed it.
Thank you, Rinaldi. Are there questions? Yep.
Yep.
1 moment, please.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Really enjoyed that. I noticed that in the code that you went for something that looks a bit like a RESTful API. Did you consider using a GraphQL schema, especially, and that's part 2 of the question, because in that case you could use AWS AppSync to generate a lot of the backend code that you had to write manually now?
That is an excellent point. So yeah, I've already used GraphQL as well for quite a number of my projects as well. So it's definitely something that I've been experimenting more or less with too. For this particular case scenario, I pretty much just decided to more or less to go with the REST API just because I feel like it's pretty much more or less, just kind of like manual implementation, just because I feel like I was wanting to pretty kind of like define things in a more, I feel like, defined way. Because like one of the things I feel about GraphQL is like it did manage to like help me as well, like for like one of my other projects pretty much as well. Like it does pretty much like help like generate the backend as well when I was like pretty much like experimenting with it too. But yeah, for this particular case scenario, I pretty much like wanted to make it a bit more simple, want to kind of like make it a bit more defined. So yeah, particularly this for this case scenario, just decided to like go for like REST API. But yeah, 100%, it can actually be done with GraphQL as well. Yeah.
Cool. With an eye on the time, I want to thank you, and people can connect with you online and walk around here afterwards. We'll just quickly have with that, we've come to the end part. Come to the end part of our meetup. As I said at the beginning, this is the marketplace section. If you or your company is hiring, please raise your hand, and Rob will hand you a microphone to give a short spiel to attract some of these wonderful, smart, awesome people that we have here in the audience. No? At the end there? Maya, this is the AWS meetup.
Hi everyone. Yes, I know it's an AWS meetup. My old team at CMD Solutions, Managed Services, is looking for senior and lead SREs. So yeah, if you're keen on being an SRE or have been an SRE, have a chat. Thanks.
Cool. Anyone else? No? Then I want to thank you all for coming, but also, of course, give a thanks to our sponsors. Once again, our gold sponsors CMD, our silver sponsors Versant and Civo, and our venue sponsor, host NAB, without whom you wouldn't get the lovely food, the location, or the drinks. Speaking of the food, there is food left. We can't leave it here. It will have to be thrown away unless some of you bravely step up and provide for yourself or your loved ones at home a nice lunch for tomorrow. From experience, I can tell you it's still really good tomorrow. So feel free to take something, and we'll be back as usual on the 25th of October, the last Wednesday of October, here with 2 new wonderful speakers, and thank you again for coming. Thank you all.